Hey everyone, welcome back to Try Not to Sleep. I'm your host, Ethan Brooks, and as always, we're here with another calm, slightly boring story from history to help you unwind. Tonight, we'll be talking about something a little odd. The 7 human traits that, according to some ancient Sumerian texts, might have been deliberately held back or limited in early humanity. Alright, get comfortable. And let's see how far you make it before you fall asleep. Most ancient stories tell us what the gods gave humanity. Fire, language, the plow, but a slab of clay sitting quietly in London's Middle East department seems to flip that script. It's not just any artifact. This is BM 78942, a hefty 25 centimeters long, almost 4,000 years old, and covered in cuneiform. For decades, experts said it held another version of the Atrahasis epic, a classic creation and flood story. Nothing new. But then you start reading the lines closely. Instead of celebrating the gifts bestowed on humans, the tablet catalogs what was deliberately withheld. Not just wisdom and immortality, but things like the knowledge of days, the bread of life, and even specific crafts. The list is oddly precise, as if someone was tracking not what humans achieved, but what they were never meant to have. That's not how creation myths usually work. Most cultures imagine progress as a ladder. Humans climbing, inventing, reaching higher. Here, it's more like a ceiling was installed from the very beginning. So, why would the Sumerians write it this way? The mainstream view is simple. The gods were administrators. They handed out roles, set boundaries, and kept order in a chaotic world. Civilization was a managed project, not a wild experiment. But this tablet hints at something more intentional. It's almost as if the blueprint for humanity included built-in restrictions, not just gifts. And the Sumerians didn't see themselves as creators of civilization, but as recipients, operating inside a system that was already configured. The British Museum's records show this fragment was catalogued in the 19th century, but the story it tells is much older. Scholars like Stephanie Daly and Wilfrid Lambert have pored over these lines, yet rarely focus on what's missing rather than what's present. There's a catch, though. The text never explains why these limitations were chosen or who made the final call. It just records the outcome, leaving motivation in the shadows. Some argue this is just myth, not memory or philosophy, just a story to explain why humans aren't gods. But that answer leaves a gap. If the Sumerians saw their limitations as part of the design, not a punishment, what does that say about how they understood their place in the world? And why did they treat these boundaries as historical facts, not just metaphor? Most cultures tuck their creation stories into a distant golden past, timeless, almost dreamlike. But Sumerian texts do something different. They anchor the beginning of humanity to a disaster, the flood, on clay prisms like the Weld Blundell, now in Oxford. The Sumerian king list spells out a sequence of rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years. Then, suddenly, the flood hits. After that, everything changes. Lifespans shrink, dynasties reset, and the world becomes recognizable. So, the flood isn't just a punishment or a moral lesson. It's a dividing line. But why build your entire history around a catastrophe? The accepted view is that these are just metaphors, ways to explain mortality, suffering, and the limits of human achievement. The gods set boundaries, the story goes, and the flood is just the moment those boundaries got real. Except the texts don't just hint at boundaries. They document a total reset. In the Atrahasis epic, the flood isn't random. It's triggered by overpopulation and human noise disturbing the gods. The solution? Wipe the slate clean. Then tweak the design. Fertility rates drop. Lifespans collapse. Even language fragments. It's almost like the Sumerians saw civilization as a system with adjustable settings, and the details get technical. The king list uses sexagesimal math to chart reigns, Sars and Nurs for the pre-flood kings. But after the flood, the math changes. No more neat units. The logic behind these numbers gets fuzzy. That's not how you'd write a simple myth. The British Museum's tablets and the Penn Museum's fragments both show the same pattern. After the flood, humans are fundamentally different. Not just unlucky, reconfigured, but then comes the pushback. Scholars argue these numbers are symbolic, not historical. They say the flood is a metaphor for the unpredictability of life, not a record of actual events. Fair enough. There's no physical evidence for a literal world-destroying flood, and the numbers are too neat to be census data. Still, the texts don't read like pure allegory. They list rulers, places, and years as if they're keeping official record. So why treat the flood as a turning point in real history, not just a story? And if the flood was a deliberate reset, who decided what the new human limits would be? And why? If the flood marked a reset, then what exactly did humans lose in the process? The old stories don't just talk about destruction. They hint at something being locked away. Most scholars say the gods simply wanted to keep humans in their place. The boundaries were about order, not punishment. People were noisy, unruly, multiplying like cattle, and the gods needed quiet. But the tablets go further. On BM 78,942 and its cousins, the lists of me, those divine decrees, show a world where civilization's core elements weren't invented by people, but handed down, or sometimes withheld. The texts spell out what humans never got: the bread of life, the knowledge of days, and even certain crafts and powers. These weren't just missing. They were off limits. So, civilization wasn't built from scratch. It was configured. The Sumerians saw themselves as recipients, not creators. Their myths say the me were stored in a single location, under one deities lock and key. Inanna's journey to steal them wasn't a metaphor for discovery. It was a heist for access. That flips the usual story on its head. Instead of celebrating human ingenuity, the narrative is about limits set from the start. The gods didn't just give out gifts. They decided what would never be allowed. But why these limits? And why so specific? No explanation is ever given in the texts. The records just list the restrictions, without any hint of regret or justification. It's as if the decision was above questioning. Archaeologists at the British Museum and Penn have pieced these fragments together. But even they admit the logic behind the selections is a mystery. Stephanie Daly, translating these lines, notes that the omissions are as deliberate as the gift. Still, some argue this is just myth-making, an ancient way to explain why humans aren't all-powerful. Maybe the Sumerians were just writing stories, not laying out a blueprint. Except the tone of these tablets is administrative, not poetic. They read like inventories, not fables. So, if these were the rules from the beginning, who wrote them? And what was the real reason for holding so much back? Most people have never heard of the 1673 fragment tucked away in the Penn Museum's Middle East galleries. But this battered piece of clay, barely holding together after nearly 4,000 years, might hold the key to how the Sumerians saw themselves. It's easy to miss. Just a few lines, faded and broken, written in the same cuneiform as the grander epics. But the contents are quietly radical. The fragment doesn't just catalog what humans received. It notes what they were denied. That's unusual. Most ancient texts celebrate what civilization gained. Writing, farming, the rule of law. Here, the focus is on what's missing from the human toolkit. So why did the scribes go out of their way to record the absences? Standard View says these stories are about the gods managing a balance, keeping humans productive, but not too powerful. The gods give just enough, then close the gate. Except the 1673 fragment reads almost like a logbook. Not a myth or a warning, but a record of decisions made. It's as if the limits on human ability weren't the result of a single moment or punishment, but a series of deliberate choices tracked over time. Now, the fragment's context is murky. It was unearthed in the 19th century, catalogued, and mostly ignored in favor of the more complete tablets. But its details don't fit neatly into the mainstream narrative. For example, the text lists withheld elements alongside those granted, side by side, as if both were equally real. That doesn't sound like allegory. But there's a problem. The fragment never explains who made these decisions, or why. It just records the outcome, with no hint of debate or regret. Some scholars argue this is just a bureaucratic style, a reflection of how Sumerians used writing for administration, not philosophy. Still, the tone is odd. If these were just stories, why treat them like inventory sheets? And if the Sumerians really did see themselves as living within a set of parameters, not just fate or luck, then what did they think about the possibility of changing them? So, if the Sumerians saw themselves as boxed in by design, who was holding the keys? Their stories point straight to the gods, not as distant, abstract forces, but as hands-on managers. Think less Zeus hurling lightning, more boardroom of project leads. Enlil, Enki, Inana, each had a portfolio. They weren't just worshipped. They were administrators, literally overseeing the blueprints for every aspect of civilization. The gods didn't just create. They assigned, withheld, and sometimes even shuffled the rules. But these assignments weren't random. The me was stored in one place, jealously guarded. Inanna's famous quest to steal them wasn't just a myth about ambition. It reads like a breach in protocol. She wanted access, not invention. So, the Sumerian gods weren't creators in the modern sense. They were stewards, configuring civilization and managing its parameters. The boundaries weren't accidental. They were the product of divine administration. That's a very different model from the Greek or Egyptian pantheons. There, gods fight, love, and meddle, but rarely micromanage the mechanics of daily life. Except the Sumerian texts go out of their way to emphasize control. every major element. Writing, kingship, agriculture was doled out, never discovered. Humans didn't stumble onto progress. They received it, sometimes grudgingly. But why so much focus on what was kept back? Some scholars, like Samuel Noah Kramer, argue that this was just a way to explain gaps in knowledge. If something was missing from society, it was because the gods hadn't handed it over yet. Still, the tone is almost bureaucratic. The gods as civil service managers, not capricious deity. There's a snag, though. If the gods were so obsessed with control, why do the stories include moments where humans nearly break out, like in Inana's theft or Adapa's brush with immortality? Are these warnings or hints that the system wasn't airtight? Skeptics say these are just narrative devices, ways to spice up otherwise dry lists. But the administrative flavor is hard to ignore, especially with so many tablets reading like official records. So if the gods were the stewards, always configuring and restricting, did the Sumerians ever imagine what would happen if someone changed the setting? And if so, what would that mean for the whole system? Most cultures celebrate inventors and pioneers, but Sumerian stories don't give humanity much credit for progress. Instead, the texts show humans as recipients, waiting for the gods to hand over the tools of civilization. Not creators, not rebels, just operators inside a system designed by someone else. It's a strange way to see yourself. The me, those cosmic decrees, weren't discovered or invented by trial and error. They were stored, guarded, and sometimes stolen, but never made from scratch. Inanna's legendary journey to collect the me wasn't about innovation. It was about access. So, civilization was less a human achievement and more a set of permissions. That's a big departure from the usual narrative. The standard explanation says, this reflects the Sumerian view of the gods as ultimate authority. People farmed, wrote and built cities because the gods allowed it, not because they figured it out themselves. But then, why do the texts go out of their way to list what was withheld? On clay tablets, like BM 78942, the inventory of what humans never got is as detailed as what they did receive. Knowledge of days, bread of life, and even certain crafts are all marked as off-limits. It's not just about gifts. It's about restrictions. That doesn't sound like a culture obsessed with human ingenuity. It sounds like a society convinced their world was configured for them, not by them. The British Museum's records show these lists were treated as official, not mythic. Stephanie Daly's translations point out the administrative flavor. These are more like ledgers than legends. But there's a catch. If the Sumerians saw themselves as passive recipients, why do their stories feature moments of near transgression, like Inana's theft or Adapa's almost immortality? Are these warnings or hints that the boundaries could be pushed? Some experts argue these tales are just narrative devices, cautionary tales to reinforce the rules. Maybe so, but the texts never quite shut the door on the possibility of change. And if the system could be hacked, even once, what else might have been possible? Was there ever a version of the story where humans actually rewrote the rules? If the system was so tightly controlled, how did anyone ever get close to breaking it? For that, you have to look at Inana. On the surface, Inana is just another goddess. Love, war, fertility, the usual. But her story isn't about following the rules. It's about rewriting them. She doesn't wait for permission. In the old texts, Inanna's rise isn't gradual. She storms the gates. Her most famous move, marching straight into the house of Enki, the keeper of the me, the divine blueprints for civilization itself. She doesn't ask. She takes. They aren't inventions. They're pre-existing, cosmic permissions, stored in one place, controlled by one deity. Inanna's heist isn't a metaphor for human discovery. It's an inside job, a transfer of power. So, why let her get away with it? Most scholars say her story reflects her status at the top of the Sumerian pantheon. She's the exception that proves the rule. The gods can bend the system, but mortals can't. Except the texts don't frame it as a one-time fluke. They treat Inanna's acquisition as a real shift in the cosmic order. After her theft, civilization changes hands. Power moves. The me are now distributed, not hoarded. That's not just myth. That's a record of a regime change. The British Museum's cuneiform tablets, catalogued and translated by experts like Samuel Noah Kramer, show that these events are listed with the same administrative tone as tax records or king lists. They're not told as legend, but as history. Still, some argue that this is just a literary device, an ancient way to explain why certain cities or cults rose to dominance. Maybe Inanna's story is just political propaganda, not a cosmic jailbreak. But the texts don't read like propaganda. They read like a ledger of what was moved, who held it, and when. So, if Inanna could shift the rules for gods, could humans ever do the same? Or was the door slammed shut after her, leaving everyone else on the outside? Most people assume civilization is a patchwork, each culture inventing its own laws, skills, and rituals over time. But the Sumerians saw it differently. For them, the core elements of society, the me, existed before anyone ever used them. Not invented, not discovered, just there. The me are listed across tablets like BM 78942 and others, stored in one location, under one god's control. They're not stories about trial and error. They're more like a cosmic software package waiting to be installed. So, when Inanna made her move, she didn't create anything new. She simply took what was already on the shelf. That's a strange way to think about progress. Most scholars say these lists are metaphors, ways to explain why some cities or rulers had certain powers, while others didn't. The gods distributed the me as needed, and that's why things happened the way they did. But the texts are oddly specific. They don't just name the me. They track who held them, when they changed hands, and what was left out. The system is described as fixed, not evolving. If something was missing from human life, it wasn't because it hadn't been invented yet. It was because it wasn't authorized. That's not how most mythologies work. In the Enuma Elish, for example, the gods create humanity to bear the burden of labor. But in Sumer, the focus is on configuration. What's allowed, what's withheld, and who gets to decide. Now this is where things get weird. The me system doesn't explain why certain powers were never distributed. Some, like immortality or perfect knowledge, remain locked away. No justification, no story, just absence. British Museum records and translations by Samuel Noah Kramer confirm the administrative tone. These aren't campfire tales. They're more like inventory logs. Still, some researchers argue this is just ancient bureaucracy, an attempt to make sense of a chaotic world by imagining everything as preordained. Maybe. But if everything was already set, why do the stories keep returning to the idea of theft, loss, or missed opportunities? And if the me were always there, waiting, what stopped anyone, human or God, from rewriting the list for good? So why do these stories read less like bedtime tales and more like official records? The Sumerians didn't just imagine their past, they archived it. Lists of kings, inventories of me, even flood accounts, all arranged in sequence, carved into clay. The tone is dry, almost bureaucratic, but the implications are anything but ordinary. They treated their mythology as history. On tablets like the well-blundled prism from Larsa, every king gets a reign, every city a founding date, every disaster a timestamp. The flood isn't a rumor. It's a line on the ledger. Before the flood, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. Afterward, the numbers collapse. Lifespans shrink. Power shifts. Except the stories don't just log what happened. They track what was lost. When Inana steals the me, it's not a fable about cleverness. It's an event, recorded alongside real rulers and real places. The theft is entered into the official narrative, as if it changed the course of civilization. So, were these stories ever meant as metaphor? Some researchers argue that Sumerian scribes blurred the line between myth and memory because they lacked our modern categories. For them, the past was a single fabric, divine acts, human deeds, and cosmic resets, all woven together. But then, why so much attention to detail? Why list missing powers, lost knowledge, or forbidden abilities as if they were actual items checked out of a storeroom? Why keep coming back to what humanity nearly had, but didn't? The British museums, BM 78,942, and Penn Museums, 1673. Fragment both show this pattern. The records are so specific it's hard to dismiss them as pure allegory. Still, there's a major pushback. Maybe these tablets are just literary devices, a way for ancient priests to justify the way things were. If something was lacking, blame the gods, not the king. That's possible. The Sumerians were expert administrators. Their myths might just be another kind of paperwork. But even if it's paperwork with a motive. So if the line between myth and history was this thin, did the Sumerians ever believe the rules could change again? Or were they just documenting a world forever locked in place? If the Sumerians saw their world as configured, not invented, who actually held the controls? The answer always circles back to the me, those mysterious decrees that defined everything from kingship to weaving. But these weren't scattered gifts. They were kept in one place, under strict supervision. The texts say the me were stored with a single deity, usually Enki, deep in the city of Eridu. He wasn't just a god of water. He was the system administrator, holding the permissions for civilization itself. So, if you wanted to change the rules, you had to get past Enki. That's why Inanna's heist matters. She didn't create new powers. She took existing ones from Enki's vault. The story doesn't paint her as a rebel, but as someone clever enough to navigate the bureaucracy and redistribute the goods. But there's a catch. The me weren't just tools. They were boundaries. If something wasn't on the list, it was off limits. Immortality, perfect knowledge, even the right to certain emotions. These weren't lost. They were never issued. It's not just about what humans could do. It's about what they were never allowed to try. The Sumerian king list and the tablets from Eridu, catalogued in the British Museum, lay this out in stark terms. The gods didn't hand out civilization in pieces. They managed it from a central hub. That doesn't sound like a society expecting the rules to change on their own. Still, some scholars argue this is all just a metaphor for political power. The me system, they say, is a reflection of how real kings controlled resources and knowledge. Maybe the gods' vault was just a stand-in for the palace storeroom. But the texts don't just describe power, they describe access. The difference is subtle, but crucial. It wasn't about who ruled, but who could even play the game. So if the me were always centralized, what would it take to break the system? And did anyone ever really try? Breaking the system meant more than just stealing a few cosmic blueprints. It meant challenging the very reason humans existed, or more accurately, why they were kept in their place. At the core of Sumerian belief sits a blunt truth. The gods didn't want to do the dirty work. Creation wasn't a gift. It was a labor contract. Humans were made to serve. That's spelled out in the Enuma Elish, a Babylonian text from the first millennium BC, but rooted in older Sumerian ideas. The gods, tired of their own toil, decide to fashion a new workforce. They use the blood of Kingu, a rebellious god, to make humans, assigning them the burden of labor. So, right from the start, mortality isn't an accident. It's a feature. But there's a twist. If humans are made from divine blood, why aren't they immortal? Why not pass on some of that godly essence? Instead, the texts insist that mortality was installed by design. It wasn't a punishment for failure or a curse for disobedience. It was the default setting. That's not how most ancient stories go. In Greek myth, for example, humans lose immortality by crossing a line, stealing fire, eating forbidden fruit, injuring the gods. The Sumerian story skips the drama. Mortality is just part of the job description, but the numbers don't always add up. Take Gilgamesh. He's 2/3 divine, yet still mortal. No partial credit, no loophole. So, what's really going on here? Was mortality a way to keep humans manageable, or is there another layer to the story? British Museum tablet BMK 3375, recovered by Hormuzd Rassam in 1853, lays out the Gilgamesh saga in detail. The math is clear, but the logic isn't. Some experts say this is all just metaphor. Ancient people wrestling with why life is short and hard. Maybe so, but the texts keep circling back to the idea that mortality was chosen, not inherited. And if that's true, who decided the limits? And could those limits ever be changed? There's a detail in the Sumerian creation story that doesn't quite fit the usual logic. Humans were made from Kingu's blood, a rebellious god, executed and repurposed for the job. If anything, you'd expect a trace of divinity to come with that. But the outcome is the opposite. Mortality is locked in, right from the start. No special inheritance, No loophole for godly gene. So why bother with divine blood at all? Scholars have long said this is just a way to explain why humans are special, but still mortal. The gods needed a workforce, so they gave us a spark, just not enough to make us dangerous. Except, the story doesn't add up. If Kingu's essence is divine, why is it used to create a being that's fundamentally limited? The text doesn't say the gods diluted the blood, or cursed it, or mixed it with clay to weaken it. They just set the parameters and moved on. It almost sounds like mortality isn't a flaw or a punishment. It's a design feature, chosen for reasons nobody bothered to record. The Enuma Elish, pieced together from tablets found in Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, spells this out. Humans are made to bear the gods' labor. Immortality isn't lost. It's never offered. But then there's Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine, still doomed to die. No partial exemption, no sliding scale. So what's the point of divine blood if it doesn't change the outcome? Some experts suggest the story is about theodicy, why bad things happen, why humans suffer. But that explanation misses something. If suffering is the issue, why not let Kingu's essence pass on some immunity, or at least a longer life? The texts never answer. Skeptics point out that these are just stories, stitched together from older myths, not meant to be consistent. Maybe the contradictions are just the result of centuries of storytelling. That's possible. But the administrative tone of the tablets, the way they list parameters like specs on a blueprint, still feels deliberate. So, if mortality was set by design, not by accident or sin, what was the real reason for keeping that limit in place? And did the Sumerians ever imagine a way to bypass it? If mortality was never an accident, how close did humans ever get to breaking the rule? The Adapa story comes closer than any other. Adapa isn't a king or a demigod. He's a priest, wise and obedient, chosen by Enki himself. One day, while out fishing, he breaks the wings of the south wind and gets summoned before the gods. The moment he steps into heaven, something strange happens. He's offered the food and water of life, straight from the god's own table. But Enki, his patron, warns him not to eat or drink anything in heaven. Adapa listens, refuses the gifts, and walks away still mortal. So the door to immortality wasn't locked. It was left open, just long enough for someone to turn it down. That's not what you'd expect from a story about divine limits. Most scholars see this as a parable about wisdom versus eternal life. Humans can be clever, but they'll never be gods. The Adapa myth, found in fragmentary tablets from Tel El Amarna, and now split between Berlin and London, seems to reinforce the idea that mortality is a choice, just not one humans get to make for themselves. Except, the story doesn't make sense if you look too closely. Why would Enki, the god who made Adapa wise, trick him into refusing immortality? Why not let him accept the offer and see what happens? Some, like scholar Samuel Noah Kramer, argue that Enki was protecting the cosmic order. Immortal humans would upset the balance, but that explanation feels thin. The tablets themselves are a mess, broken, incomplete, with entire lines missing. Translators admit we may never know the full story. Skeptics point out that the Adapa tale could just be another version of the forbidden fruit motif, a story that floats between cultures and gets retold with new details. But the Sumerian version is different. It's not about punishment. It's about an opportunity missed, A door quietly closed. So if Adapa was wise enough to reach the threshold, why was he denied the chance to step through? And did anyone ever try again? Adapa stands at the edge of the divine table, offered immortality by the gods themselves. But he turns it down, not because he's unworthy, but because he's told to. That one moment splits the path. Wisdom on one side, eternal life on the other. So why did wisdom and immortality have to be mutually exclusive? The usual answer is that the gods wanted to keep the cosmic order intact. Humans could have knowledge, even divine insight, but not the endless life that made the gods who they were. Letting mortals cross that line would blur the boundaries too much. But Adapa's story doesn't play out like a simple morality tale. He doesn't rebel. He doesn't even question the warning. He just obeys, and the door quietly shuts behind him. Except there's a detail that doesn't fit. Enki, the god who gave Adapa his wisdom, is also the one who blocks his shot at immortality. Why grant someone the ability to understand the secrets of the universe, only to keep them locked into a short, fragile life? That's not how most ancient stories work. Usually, wisdom is the path to transcendence. In the Greek tradition, cleverness leads to trouble, but sometimes to reward. Here, it's almost a trap. The Adapa tablets, found in the ruins of Tel El Amarna, and now split between Berlin and London, showed just how old and widespread this story was. It's not an isolated myth. It's a thread running through Mesopotamian thinking for centuries. Some scholars argue that the real point is obedience. Adapa's wisdom lets him survive the journey to heaven, but only because he follows orders. Immortality is never really on the table, but that explanation leaves something out. If the gods wanted blind obedience, why make Adapa so clever in the first place? And why leave the offer of immortality hanging in the air, just out of reach? Skeptics say this is just another version of the forbidden fruit story, a warning about knowing your place. But the Sumerian version is colder, more bureaucratic. There's no punishment, just a missed opportunity and a closed file. So, was the real lesson about the limits of human ambition, or was it about never understanding the rules in the first place? And if wisdom could get you to the gates, what would it take to actually step through? Most stories about gods and mortals come with a clear lesson, but Enki's role in the Adapa myth is anything but straightforward. He's the one who gives Adapa wisdom, then turns around and blocks his shot at immortality. It almost feels like a setup. Why make someone smart enough to reach the gates of heaven, only to instruct him to refuse the very thing that would make him more than human? Some say it's about maintaining the cosmic order. The gods need boundaries, and Enki is just doing his job as the keeper of those limits. Wisdom can be handed out, but eternal life is a privilege reserved for the divine. But the decision feels oddly personal. Enki isn't just enforcing the rules. He's manipulating the outcome. He warns Adapa in advance, stacking the deck so that the offer of immortality is never truly on the table. It's like inviting someone to a feast and then telling them not to eat. So, was Enki protecting humanity, or was he protecting something else? The tablets from Tel El Amarna, now in Berlin and London, don't give a reason. They just record the facts. Adapa, given wisdom, offered immortality, turns it down on Enki's advice. There's no speech, no justification, just a blank space where the motive should be. It's not just an oversight. In other myths, gods are jealous, vengeful, or even compassionate. Here, Enki's motivation is left hanging, unresolved. The story is all action, no explanation. That's not how most ancient myths work. Usually there's a moral, or at least a hint at the god's reasoning. In this case, scholars have filled the gap with guesses. Maybe Enki feared humans would upset the balance. Or maybe it was about keeping the god's privileges exclusive. But those are just interpretations. The text itself is silent. Some argue that this silence is the point. Maybe the Sumerians wanted to show that divine logic is beyond human understanding, or that the rules themselves are arbitrary. Still, it's hard to shake the sense that something's missing. If Enki's motivation is never spelled out, was it because the scribes themselves didn't know? Or did they think some boundaries shouldn't be questioned at all? And if the real reasons were hidden even from the storytellers, what does that say about the world they lived in, and the limits we might still be living with? Numbers in Sumerian history don't just count. They shape the entire story. The king lists, especially the ones carved onto the weld-blundell prism, lay out reigns that stretch for tens of thousands of years before the flood. These aren't random numbers. They're built on a base 60 system, sexagesimal math, where 1 sar equals 3,600 years. But at flood, everything changes. Suddenly, kings rule for hundreds of years, not thousands. The neat mathematical units vanish. Lifespans collapse, dynasties get shorter, and the numbers lose their old symmetry. So, what happened? Most historians say these huge numbers are just symbolic. They argue the pre-flood reigns were never meant to be taken literally, just a way to show a mythical golden age, a time before the world became ordinary. Except the math is so precise it's hard to ignore. Whole sars and nurs for the antediluvian kings, all perfectly divisible by 60. Then, after the flood, the pattern breaks. The reigns become irregular, messy, almost as if someone changed the rules mid-game. It doesn't look like a gradual evolution. It looks like a deliberate reset. The weld-blundell prism, catalogued as a 1923.444, and now in Oxford, isn't just a list. It's a ledger, a record that treats these reigns as historical fact, not metaphor. Each king, each city, each number is logged with the same administrative tone as a tax record. But why would a civilization so obsessed with order suddenly abandon its own system? Some scholars suggest these numbers were just a way to legitimize new dynasties. By linking current rulers to impossibly ancient forebears, they could claim divine favor or cosmic continuity. That's possible. But if it's just propaganda, why bother with the math? Why not invent more plausible numbers? And if the flood really was a threshold, did the rules of time and power actually change? Or were the scribes just rewriting the story to fit a new world? Now, if the numbers themselves were part of the system, what else might have been recalibrated after the flood? After the flood, the numbers on the king lists don't just get smaller, they get weird. Gone are the clean, round reigns of the antediluvian kings. Instead, the post-flood rulers inherit a system that seems hastily rewritten. Before the flood, every king's reign fits the map. Multiples of 60, predictable as clockwork. But then, the pattern shatters. The first post-flood king rules for 1,200 years, the next for 960, then 670, then 400. No more whole sars, no neat division. It's as if someone took the old formula and tossed it out the window. So, what changed? Scholars have always said these numbers are just symbolic. The flood marks the end of mythic time, they argue, and ushers in a more realistic human scale. The shrinking rains are supposed to show the world becoming less magical, more ordinary. Except the transition isn't smooth. Instead of a gradual decline, there's a sudden break. One generation, kings are practically immortal. The next are dropping like flies by ancient standards. It's almost like a software update gone wrong. The Weld-Blundell prism, dated to the early 2nd millennium BC and stored in Oxford, lays it all out. The administrative tone never changes, even as the logic behind the numbers falls apart. So were the scribes just trying to make sense of a new reality? Or were they covering up a bigger shift in the rules? Some experts say the inconsistencies are just the result of centuries of copying and political meddling. Maybe later dynasties wanted to distance themselves from the impossible claims of the past. But if that's true, why keep the flood as the dividing line? Why not just start fresh? And if the flood really did reset the system, what else, besides time, got recalibrated for humanity? Was it only about lifespan and kingship? Or did the limits reach deeper into what people could know, do, or even imagine? After the flood, the Sumerian world wasn't just smaller. It was different in ways that go beyond numbers on a clay tablet. Lifespans collapsed, sure, but so did the list of things humans could do. The post-flood texts talk about new rules. Children who never grow up, women who can't have children, and a world where language is no longer unified. It's as if the reset wasn't just about who ruled or how long they lived. Something deeper got rewritten. The Atrahasis epic, found on tablets like BM 78,1942 in London, spells out these changes. After the flood, the gods don't just reduce lifespans. They introduce infertility, childlessness, and even confusion of tongues. The story doesn't treat these as punishments, but as deliberate settings. So, the flood isn't just a wipeout event. It's a threshold. Before, humanity was almost limitless. Long lives, booming populations, maybe even a shot at divine knowledge. After, every parameter is dialed down. The gods are no longer just managers. They're system architects, recalibrating everything from biology to culture. But why go that far? The accepted view is that these changes were necessary to keep humans manageable. Too many people, too much noise. The gods needed peace. So they set caps on fertility and lifespan. Except the texts don't explain why these particular limits were chosen, or why some capacities were targeted while others were left alone. And there's another strange detail. The king lists and epics record these changes with the same administrative tone as tax records. No drama, no moralizing, just a new set of specs for humanity. Archaeologists and translators, like Stephanie Daly, have pointed out that the post-flood redesign reads less like myth and more like a policy update. Still, some argue that these stories are just metaphors for social change, ways to explain why the world feels narrower and more difficult than legends suggest. Maybe the flood is just a symbol for the loss of innocence, not a real reset. But the Sumerian tablets never say the old capabilities were lost by accident. They're documented as deliberate, almost clinical choices. So, if the flood was a threshold where everything got recalibrated, what else might have been quietly edited out of the human experience? And who decided which doors to close and which to leave open? If you follow the numbers in the Atrahasis epic, something jumps out. Human population doesn't just grow. It explodes, following what the text calls bull-like curves. The phrase isn't poetic. It's mathematical. The story lays it out. After humans are created, their numbers surge so fast that the gods can't sleep. The noise becomes unbearable. That's when the first interventions begin. Plagues, droughts, famine, and finally, the flood. But this isn't nature running wild. The narrative treats population growth as a parameter, not a side effect. It's as if the gods set the dial too high, then scrambled to bring things back under control. The text doesn't show humans inventing ways to multiply or survive. It shows them reacting to limits imposed from above. So, was this bull-like growth an accident, or was it built in from the start? The usual reading says ancient people just noticed how populations can boom, then crash. They saw it in herds, in crops, in families. The gods in the story simply reflect that reality, trying to manage something that's always on the brink of chaos. Except, the way the text frames it, the growth isn't just observed. It's engineered. The gods react not with resignation, but with targeted fixes, introducing death, disease, even infertility. Each time, the solution is specific. The result is a stepwise compression of human potential. It's almost as if the Sumerians saw population dynamics as programmable. The British Museum's BM 78,942, with its administrative tone, supports this. The interventions read less like punishments and more like adjustments to a system that's gotten out of balance. But there's a pushback. Some scholars argue that these stories are just metaphors for the unpredictability of life. Droughts, plagues, and floods were common enough. The gods, they say, are just stand-ins for nature's randomness. That's one way to see it. But the precision of the interventions and the way the narrative spells out each change suggests a different mindset, one that treats civilization itself as a set of levers and switches. So, if even something as fundamental as fertility could be dialed up or down, what other aspects of the human experience were quietly configured behind the scene? And how much of what we call natural might have been, in their eyes, the result of someone else's design? If fertility could be tuned like a setting, what about the way people spoke and understood each other? The Sumerian texts don't just mention population control. They hint at something even stranger: the intentional splintering of language. Most ancient stories treat language diversity as a natural result of migration and time. People drift apart, dialects change, and eventually new tongues emerge. It's a slow, organic process. But the Sumerian records flipped that expectation. In the aftermath of the flood, the texts describe a world where languages are suddenly fragmented. It's not gradual. One moment, everyone understands each other. The next, confusion reigns. The story reads less like an observation and more like a deliberate intervention. Why would anyone want to engineer misunderstanding? The accepted view says these tales are metaphors for cultural change. As cities grew and new groups arrived, communication broke down. The gods in these stories just personify the chaos of rapid urbanization. Except the texts go out of their way to frame this as a decision, not a side effect. On the clay tablets, the gods don't just react, they implement. Fertility is dialed down, and language is split, all in the name of keeping humanity manageable. The Atrahasis epic, preserved on fragments like those in London's British Museum, lays out the sequence. Too many people, too much noise, too much unity. So, the system gets a patch. It's a level of control that feels almost modern. Population, communication, even the potential for cooperation. Nothing is left to chance. The gods aren't just watching, they're configuring. But some argue this is reading too much into the texts. Maybe the stories are just a way to explain why the world is messy and complicated. After all, there's no archaeological evidence that languages were ever unified or that fertility rates suddenly dropped by decree. Still, the Sumerian scribes didn't write as if these were metaphors. They logged these changes with the same tone as a royal edict or a tax law. So, if even the way people talked was subject to divine adjustment, what else in the human story might have been quietly set behind the scenes? And if these parameters could be changed once, could they ever be changed again? If language, fertility, and lifespan could all be dialed up or down, what did the ancient scribes actually think they were recording? Were these stories about loss, about a paradise ruined, or about a system running exactly as planned? Most interpretations lean toward tragedy. The flood, the scattering of languages, the shrinking of lifespans, all seen as punishments, cosmic consequences for human overreach. The gods, annoyed by noise and chaos, clamp down on humanity. But the Sumerian tablets themselves don't sound mournful. They read more like meeting minutes than laments. The king lists, the Atrahasis epic, even the fragments from Larsa and Nineveh, each one logs the changes with a matter-of-fact tone. No hand-wringing, no sorrow, just a new set of specs. So, was this loss, or was it just an arrangement? Parameters set, roles assigned, everyone moving forward under new rule. That's not how we usually read ancient myth. We expect drama, regret, some sense of a fall from grace. But the records from the British Museum and Penn Museum don't dwell on what's missing. They simply document what's changed. It's almost bureaucratic. The gods adjust the settings. The scribes write it down, and civilization continues. There's no sense of rebellion, no attempt to reverse the changes, just acceptance. But that's where things get strange. If these were just stories about fate, why bother with so much administrative detail? Why list every king, every year, every adjustment as if someone might need to audit the process later? Scholars argue this is just the Sumerian mindset, obsessed with order and record-keeping. Maybe so, but the sheer precision, the way each change is logged without commentary, feels deliberate. Still, there's no way to know if the scribes saw these changes as tragic or just part of the deal. The texts never say whether losing immortality or unified language was a catastrophe or simply a new normal. And if the clay records are silent on motive, what else might they be leaving out? Did the Sumerians ever imagine a way to negotiate for changes? Or was the arrangement always final? If the boundaries of human life were set in stone, what about the kings who ruled before the flood? The Sumerian king list doesn't just stretch the imagination. It blows right past it. Antediluvian rulers supposedly reigned for tens of thousands of years. Not a tile. Some names are credited with 28,800 years on the throne, others with 36,000. These aren't vague legends. They're logged in cuneiform, catalogued on the Weld Blundell Prism in Oxford since the early 20th century. So, what were the scribes trying to say? Most researchers believe these numbers are symbolic. The reigns are too long to be real, so the thinking goes, and must represent dynastic periods, cosmic cycles, or theological ideals. The flood, in this view, marks the end of mythic time and the start of something closer to reality. Except the numbers aren't random. They're built on a base 60 system, sexagesimal math, where each SAR equals 3,600 years. The list is neat, precise, and mathematically consistent. Then, after the flood, the pattern shatters. Lifespans drop, the math gets messy, and the sense of order disappears. It's as if the system was intentionally reset. The Sumerian scribes didn't just record these reigns as legend. They logged them alongside real cities, rivers, and rulers. The administrative tone never wavers. It's all treated as historical fact. But why keep such impossible numbers? Some say these reigns were a way to connect the living king to a divine legacy, an unbroken chain stretching back to the dawn of time. Others argue the numbers encode lost knowledge of astronomy or ritual calendars. Still, the abrupt switch after the flood is hard to explain away. If the pre-flood kings were meant to be immortal, why did the gods suddenly decide to impose limits? Was this a punishment, a correction, or just the next phase of a project? Skeptics point out that ancient scribes often exaggerated for effect. Maybe the numbers were never meant to be taken literally. But then, why bother with such careful math? Why not just say, a very long time? So, if the flood marks the end of eternal reigns, what did the Sumerians think they'd lost? And did they ever hope those doors could reopen? The flood isn't just a plot twist. It's a hard reset. Before the deluge, kings ruled for ages. Knowledge flowed, and the world felt wide open. Then, in a single event, the slate was wiped clean. Suddenly, everything changed. Lifespans shrank, dynasties fractured. Even the way people lived and reproduced was rewritten. The Sumerian texts don't describe this as a slow decline, but as a sharp break, a deliberate overhaul of the system. It's not just about destruction. The stories go out of their way to show the gods stepping in, not to punish, but to reconfigure. The Atrahasis epic, pieced together from tablets in London and Philadelphia, spells out the process. After the flood, the gods introduce childlessness, shorten lives, and scatter languages. These aren't accidents. They're settings chosen and enforced. So, the flood isn't a tragedy. It's a reboot. The king lists, like the Weld Blundell Prism, treat the pre- and post-flood worlds as fundamentally different. The math changes, the rules change, even the way time is measured changes. It's like someone hit factory reset on civilization. But why go to such lengths? The standard answer is that humanity had become too noisy, too numerous, too disruptive. The gods needed peace, so they imposed limits. Except the texts never dwell on loss or regret. There is no mourning for what's gone, just a record of new boundaries, logged with the same tone as a shipment of grain. The Sumerians didn't write about nostalgia for the old world. They wrote about adapting to the new one. Still, some argue these stories are just metaphors for natural disasters and social upheaval. Maybe the flood was a way to explain why life got harder, why old glories faded. But the detail in the records, the careful tracking of what changed and when, suggests something more intentional. If the flood was a reset, did the Sumerians ever imagine a way back? Or did they see themselves as permanently locked into a world with lower ceilings and shorter horizons? If the flood was a hard reset, you'd expect the Sumerians to leave some hint about how, or if the old world could ever return. But the texts stay silent on that point. The boundaries are drawn, the new parameters set, and then nothing. No roadmap back, no instructions for undoing the change. So where did these new limits actually come from? Most scholars say they're just metaphors for human finitude. The gods, annoyed by noise and chaos, clamp down on lifespans, fertility, even understanding itself. It's a neat explanation. Mortality and confusion as the price for survival. But the tablets never explain why these particular limits were chosen. The king lists don't say why post-flood rulers live shorter lives. The Atrahasis epic doesn't spell out why childlessness and fragmented language were necessary. The changes are recorded, not justified. It's a strange omission. If these boundaries were meant to teach a lesson, why not make the lesson explicit? Instead, the texts just move on, as if the new settings are self-explanatory. There's another odd detail. The Sumerian records don't describe the loss of perceptual abilities, like wisdom, memory, or understanding, as a tragedy. They're simply noted, like a change in the weather. So, maybe the Sumerians didn't see these limits as punishments at all. Perhaps they thought of them as part of the world's architecture, as unchangeable as the laws of physics. The gods set the rules, and humanity adapted. British Museum tablets, like BM 78942, and the Weld Blundell Prism in Oxford, both list these changes with an administrative tone. No drama, no regret. Just a new set of specs. Some researchers push back, arguing that these are just stories, not blueprint. Maybe the Sumerians never intended anyone to take these limits literally. But the consistency across so many texts, and the lack of any alternative version, makes that hard to dismiss. If the origins of these perceptual boundaries are never explained, did the Sumerians ever wonder who, if anyone, could change them? Or was the real mystery why the question was never asked at all? Most ancient stories about creation start with chaos, then move toward order. Gods battling monsters, shaping land, handing out gifts to humanity. Sumerian records don't follow that script. Instead, the earliest clay tablets, like those unearthed by lantern light at Nineveh or catalogued as BM 78942 in London, read more like project notes than poetry. They list what was set in place, what was held back, and who was responsible for each part. But the tone isn't celebratory. It's administrative. The gods don't just create, they allocate. Every aspect of civilization, from writing to weaving, is assigned, not discovered. So, the story isn't about human achievement. It's about permission. The big surprise? The texts are just as careful about what humans never got. Immortality, perfect knowledge, the bread of life. All tracked as items left off the list. That's not how most creation myths work. Other cultures focus on what was gained: fire, language, agriculture. The Sumerians log what was withheld. The accepted view is that these stories are just metaphors for the limits of human life. The gods set boundaries, and people live within them. Simple, right? Except the records don't explain why. On the Weld-Blundell prism from Larsa or the fragments in the Penn Museum, every change is documented. Lifespans, fertility, even the ability to understand the gods' language. All recorded, like entries in a ledger. But there's never a reason given for the choices. No speeches, no debates, no justification. Just a list of what is and what isn't. Some scholars suggest this is just the Sumerian obsession with order, an urge to catalog everything, even the gaps. Maybe the boundaries were so fundamental, nobody thought to question them. But that feels like a dodge. If the scribes could record every detail of kingship, flood, and famine, why not ask who set the limits, or why some doors stayed closed? And if the records are silent on the origins of these boundaries, what else might be hiding in the gaps between the lines? So why don't scholars dig deeper into these missing justifications? For decades, the answer's been simple. The texts are myth, not blueprint. Sumerian stories, they say, are just reflections of how ancient people made sense of a confusing world. Nothing more. But the framework itself rarely gets a second look. Most academic commentary focuses on translation, chronology, or the evolution of religious ideas. When it comes to the idea that civilization's limits were set deliberately, the conversation stops almost before it starts. It's treated as a curiosity, not a serious proposal. But then you notice how the tablets are structured. They aren't just poetic tale. They're administrative, almost contractual. What was given? What was withheld? Who signed off? So why is this approach left out of most discussions? One reason is that the evidence feels slippery. The clay tablets don't spell out motives or debates. There's no why in the margins, just a record of decision. That makes it easy to dismiss the whole framework as over-interpretation. Except the pattern repeats across centuries and sites. From Nineveh's lantern-lit digs to the Weld-Blundell prism in Oxford, the same administrative tone appears. Names, reigns, parameters, each one logged with a precision that's hard to write off as pure storytelling. Then there's the fact that Sumerian scribes used the same cuneiform for both myth and tax records. The line between legend and ledger is thinner than we expect. But that's exactly what makes the framework so hard to engage with. If you're trained to separate myth from administration, you might miss the possibility that the Sumerians didn't see a difference. Still, most scholars argue that without explicit statements of intent, we're just projecting modern ideas onto ancient texts. Maybe they're right. Maybe the administrative style is just a quirk of Sumerian bureaucracy, not a sign of deliberate design. Yet, the silence is hard to ignore. If the framework is so consistently documented, why is it so rarely discussed? And if both scholars and storytellers avoid the question of motive, what does that say about the boundaries we're still not ready to cross? Every time someone cracks open a cuneiform tablet, the same puzzle comes up. Why do these ancient records sound so much like meeting minutes, not myths? For 4 millennia, the boundaries set in those texts have stayed right where the scribes left them. Lifespan, knowledge, even the number of languages, all logged, all fixed, all unexplained. The Sumerians didn't just accept their limits. They wrote them into the foundation of their world. But the reason behind those choices? Still missing. You'd think, after thousands of years, someone would have filled in the blanks. Yet the motivation for why certain gifts were withheld, or why the reset after the flood was so total, remains a blank space. The texts lay out what changed, but never why. So, the official story is that these were just metaphors, ways to explain why life is short, why kings don't live forever, why people can't understand the gods. The boundaries are just reminders of human frailty. Except the records don't read like cautionary tales. They read like specifications. The king lists, the Atrahasis epic, the Adapa myth. Each one catalogues a design, not a downfall. The British Museum's BM 78942, the Weld-Blundell prism, the fragments from Nineveh and Larsa. All use the same tone, the same structure, the same silence on motive. It's not just a Sumerian quirk. Later Babylonian and Assyrian copies keep the same omission. So what if the scribes were documenting something they didn't, or couldn't, question? Maybe the rules were so deeply embedded, nobody thought to challenge them. Or maybe the act of recording was itself a way to keep the system running. But then, why does the uncertainty last? Even today, scholars debate whether these texts are myth, memory, or administrative record. The boundaries between those categories are as blurry now as they were in ancient Ur or Nineveh. The clay tablets refuse to give a final answer. Some experts argue that we're just reading too much into bureaucratic habits. Maybe the Sumerians were obsessed with lists, not with cosmic secrets. Maybe the silence is just a gap in the data. But if that's true, why does the same silence echo across every version, every era, every copy? And if the question of motive was never answered, is it because the answer was lost? Or because it was never meant to be found? There's a detail in the Sumerian stories that keeps slipping through the cracks. It's not just what humans were missing, but how their limits were set. Almost like someone was tuning a machine, not raising a child. The old myths say humans were made from divine material, Kinga's blood, or sometimes a mix of clay and godly essence. You'd expect that to mean humans were just diluted gods, a little less powerful, a little more breakable, but still on the same spectrum. But the math never adds up. Gilgamesh, for example, is described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. Yet he's mortal, just like everyone else. No partial immortality, no special privileges, just a king who can die. So, the proportions don't matter. It's as if the recipe was irrelevant. The real rules were set somewhere else. The texts keep circling back to this point. Whether it's the Enuma Elish or the Epic of Gilgamesh, both preserved in the British Museum. Both pored over by generations of experts. The outcome is always the same. Mortality isn't a sliding scale. It's a switch, on or off. That's not how you'd expect a world built on divine genetics to work. Instead, the boundaries for humans look more like parameters on a form than consequences of their origin. Lifespan, fertility, wisdom, each one set to a specific value, regardless of what humans are made from. So maybe the Sumerians weren't thinking in terms of inheritance at all. Maybe they saw themselves as configured, not descended. But then, why bother with the elaborate stories about blood and clay? Why keep describing humans as part god, part mud, if the outcome is always predetermined? Some argue these are just narrative flourishes, ways to make the stories grander, more memorable. The real message, they say, is about the limits themselves, not the ingredients. That's possible. But the consistency is hard to ignore. If the proportions never change the outcome, what was the point of tracking them so closely? And if the settings were fixed from the start, who decided which switches to flip? And what would happen if someone tried to change them? In the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a moment that breaks the pattern. Gilgamesh finally finds the plant that restores youth, a second chance at immortality, hidden at the bottom of the sea. He doesn't eat it right away. Instead, he sets it aside, planning to share it with the elders of Europe. But then a snake appears. No god send it, no divine decree. The serpent simply snatches the plant while Gilgamesh bathes, slithers off, and sheds its skin. A silent, wordless theft. So, what just happened? Most interpretations say the snake is a symbol. Nature's way of showing that immortality is always just out of reach. The gods don't intervene because the world itself enforces the rules. Except, this isn't how Sumerian stories usually work. Divine agents are everywhere in these myths. Every major shift, lifespan, language, fertility, comes from a god's hand. But here, the most consequential loss in the story is delivered by a creature with no apparent orders. It's a break in the system. Some suggest the snake is a stand-in for the gods, acting on their behalf without being named. Others claim it's just a narrative device, a way to explain why humans can't reclaim what was lost. But the text doesn't give the serpent any motive, any voice, or any link to the gods. It just acts. The British Museum holds the clay tablet, BMK 3375, where this scene is preserved. Scholars like Andrew George have translated and debated its meaning, but the lack of a clear agent still stands out. If the system was so tightly managed, why leave something this important to chance? Skeptics point out that ancient authors didn't always need a god behind every twist. Sometimes a snake is just a snake. Maybe, but the Sumerians were obsessed with agency and order. Leaving the theft of immortality unassigned feels intentional, or like a gap in the story that nobody wanted to fill. So, if the rules could be broken by something outside the divine chain of command, what else might have slipped through the cracks? And could humans ever exploit those loopholes? Or was the system always one step ahead? If a snake could upend the gods' plans without any orders, what does that say about the limits set for humans? The Sumerian stories lay out a world where nearly everything is managed. Lifespans, fertility, even memory. Yet every so often something slips by that no one seems to have planned for. The accepted view is that these boundaries were absolute. The gods set the specs. Humans lived within them, and the rare exceptions, like Adapa's brush with immortality or Gilgamesh's lost plant, just reinforce the rules by showing how close, yet unreachable, the other side really is. But the stories themselves don't always play by those rules. Sometimes the system glitches. A serpent takes the plant. Adapa turns down eternal life because of a warning he can't verify. There is never a clear explanation for why these loopholes exist, or why they're closed so quickly after being exposed. It's almost as if the system is self-correcting. One step ahead, always patching vulnerabilities as soon as they appear. But then, why write the stories at all? If the outcome is always the same, what's the point of showing the cracks in the first place? The British Museum's BMK 3375. The tablets from Nineveh and the fragments in Berlin all document these moments without commentary. They're logged with the same neutral tone as king lists and city ledgers. So, were the Sumerians hinting at the possibility of change? Or just reminding everyone that the rules, however arbitrary, are inescapable? Some argue these tales are simply cautionary, reminders to stay in your lane. Others say they're evidence that even the most rigid system has its blind spots. But there's no evidence that anyone ever exploited these gaps for real change. The stories always end with the boundary restored, the loophole closed, the human left on the outside. Still, you have to wonder, if the stories keep circling these moments, did the Sumerians believe there was always a chance, however slim, that someone might finally break through? And if so, what would it actually mean to live outside the conditions set in clay?